This video examines the landmark case of New York Times Company versus United States, often called the Pentagon Papers case. The case began in 1971 after the New York Times started publishing excerpts from the classified Pentagon Papers. The Nixon administration sought a federal injunction to stop publication, arguing it would cause irreparable harm to national security. Daniel Ellsberg, a RAND analyst, leaked the 7,000-page classified study. The government sought a temporary restraining order, arguing the papers contained sensitive information. The Times countered that the public had a right to know, and prior restraint was unconstitutional. The Pentagon Papers were commissioned to catalog U.S. involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. The study was divided into 5 chapters, detailing troop movements, diplomatic events, and financial aid during the war. When the study was circulated in 1967, responses were mixed. It became a comprehensive record used for budgetary hearings and scholarly work, even leading to investigative pieces that questioned the Gulf of Tonkin narrative. The Pentagon Papers detailed how successive administrations misled the public about the war. Daniel Ellsberg, the source, leaked the documents. The Nixon administration immediately sought an injunction, which led to a legal battle that tested free speech and resulted in the Supreme Court ruling against prior restraint. The case revealed President Nixon's efforts to compile a dossier to discredit the Times. A media coalition published excerpts despite the ban. The case set a precedent for whistleblowers and led to the Classified Information Procedures Act of 1974. The Times focused on First Amendment rights and public interest. Government witnesses argued that publication posed a severe risk to national security. Daniel Ellsberg's testimony was central to the defense. The government argued for prior restraint based on national security. The Times asserted the First Amendment protected their right to publish. This case tested the heavy burden of proof required to halt publication. Key figures in the case included Daniel Ellsberg, investigative journalists like Neil Sheehan and Katharine Graham, and other vital witnesses and legal minds who shaped the arguments. The Times called experts, including legal scholars and journalists, to argue against prior restraint. They emphasized the importance of a free press and claimed no immediate harm would result, focusing on the public's right to information. Daniel Ellsberg, the reluctant whistleblower, testified under anonymity. He argued the documents were historical, not current operational information, caused no harm, and served the public interest by exposing government deception. Ellsberg's testimony was crucial to the Times' defense. He maintained the documents were historical, caused no harm to security, and that the public needed the truth about government deception. Former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara testified for the Times. He affirmed the validity of the papers as a genuine internal analysis and stated that fears of national security damage were overstated. McNamara's testimony validated the Pentagon Papers as a genuine study. He undercut the government's national security claims by stating the documents were not a threat to U.S. forces. Investigative journalist Seymour Hersh testified on the necessity of press freedom. He cited historical precedent against prior restraint and warned of a chilling effect if the injunction were granted, defending the marketplace of ideas. Seymour Hersh argued against the chilling effect of prior restraint. He emphasized the press's role in exposing misconduct, citing Neer versus Minnesota on the unconstitutionality of prior restraint. Constitutional scholar Professor Alexander Johnson explained the strict scrutiny required for prior restraint. He argued the government bore an extraordinary burden and that speculative fear could not outweigh the public interest in the truth. Professor Johnson, the Times legal expert, explained the strict scrutiny for prior restraint claims. He argued the government's speculative fear could not outweigh the public interest, emphasizing the heavy burden of proof. Cross-examination intensely scrutinized the government's national security claims. Attorneys questioned if the documents were historical or operational and focused on the lack of evidence for immediate, irreparable harm. The trial involved intense scrutiny of classified documents and high-stakes legal maneuvering, pitting the executive branch against the free press. The government claimed irreparable harm to national security, fearing diplomatic and military risk. The Nixon administration sought an injunction, which served as the central legal basis for demanding prior restraint. Ellsberg's testimony was the emotional core of the defense. Cross-examination challenged claims of national security harm, leading to debates about the nature of the information, history versus ongoing operations. High-ranking officials testified for the government, focusing on potential diplomatic and military harm. They claimed that publication would cause irreparable national damage, justifying prior restraint. The Nixon administration immediately sought a court injunction, arguing the publication risked military and diplomatic security. They requested a temporary restraining order to halt the series immediately. The U.S. federal government actively argued that national security risks required stopping the release of classified information. The conflict centered on executive power versus First Amendment rights. Daniel Ellsberg's act made the trial necessary. Though called as a fact witness, he used the stand to argue the papers were a chronicle of governmental deceit. He reframed his motive as civic duty, not sabotage. Government witnesses, consisting of high-ranking officials, claimed publication risked national security damage. Their testimony detailed potential diplomatic and military harm, emphasizing the need for prior restraint. Ellsberg was called as a reluctant witness for the government. He countered the attempt to portray him as a disgruntled leaker, using the platform to expose systemic governmental deceit and argue the war was the true crime. Ben Bradlee, editor of The Washington Post, testified to authenticate the documents and defend the paper's exhaustive vetting process. He framed publishing the papers as a vital public service and an ethical principle of accountability. Bradlee defended the Post's editorial vetting process and the authenticity of the papers. His testimony framed publishing as a vital public service, defending the First Amendment's role in holding power accountable. Morton G. Halperin, who helped commission this study, was called to validate its authenticity. However, he confirmed the study's central conclusion of systematic governmental deceit, inadvertently endorsing the paper's legitimacy. Halperin, the architect of the study, validated the Pentagon paper's authenticity. He confirmed the damning conclusion of governmental deceit, unintentionally endorsing the paper's legitimacy for the press. John N. Moose, a mid-level Defense Department aide, testified about the logistical process of creating the study. His ordinary testimony highlighted the bureaucracy that produced the evidence of its own failures. Aide John N. Moose testified on the technical and logistical processes. His testimony highlighted the bureaucratic machinery that created the secret history, making the leak seem like an inevitable release of pressure. The trial court denied the government's request for a permanent injunction, ruling they failed to meet the high burden for prior restraint. The Nixon administration immediately appealed, sending the case rapidly to the Supreme Court. The trial court denied the injunction, finding the burden for prior restraint unmet. The Nixon administration quickly appealed the adverse decision, moving the case through the federal appellate system. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 against the Nixon administration, affirming the constitutional protection of a free press. The government failed to show publication would cause direct, irreparable harm. The majority affirmed that the government failed to meet the heavy burden of prior restraint. The ruling established that publication must cause direct, immediate, and irreparable harm to be halted. Dissenting justices focused on the rapid timeline, arguing the court acted too quickly to fully review the documents. Some believed the government successfully proved a national danger. The Supreme Court's ruling allowed the Times to resume publishing, establishing a strong precedent against prior restraint and affirming the press's role as a watchdog against government misconduct.